In this video, we're going to look at how the environment influences traits. So as review, remember, DNA, protein, trait. And now we're going to look at this thing called gene expression. And that's simply how genes become traits. And it's going to be a little more complicated than we've been saying. But how the DNA becomes a trait is how that gene has been expressed. And there's a number of things that influence this. Obviously, the number one thing is the DNA code itself. Because as we know, the DNA is what codes for the protein that then creates the trait. But what you may not know is that the environment also has a really big influence on how these genes become traits. And you can see this in just everyday life, and you can see it especially with things like identical twins. Identical twins do not look exactly the same because they have not had the exact same environmental influences. They have the exact same DNA, but they don't end up having the exact same traits because of the environmental influences on gene expression. So let's look at how the environment actually does this. So the first thing is that the environment can change how genes are actually turned on and off. And we call this gene activation. It can also determine how much of a protein is made. We're going to call this transcriptional regulation. It regulates whether or not how much the gene is turned into a protein. It can influence how the trait actually shows up. We'll look at that. And it can actually change the DNA code itself. And this is through mutations. And we will look much more in depth at mutations in a future lesson. So let's look at how this impacts organisms. In a lot of ways, this is very beneficial because when the environment changes, you need to change, in some cases, how your traits react. And so now you can respond to changes in your environment. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of detrimental impacts that can result in many diseases as a result of environmental influences. And so we'll look at those. So first, let's look at gene activation. So that's turning on and off genes. Some beneficial things about this: puberty. When an individual hits puberty, a whole bunch of genes are activated that cause the person to go through that developmental change. Color patterns. We're going to look at these a little more here in a second, but think about things like Arctic animals that turn white in the cold. And reptile genders. You may not know this, but the temperature that the eggs incubate under actually determines their gender. So if it's really cold, you'll end up getting a lot more females because female babies are more likely to survive. And so that helps the reptiles actually have more babies survive. All right, so we're going to look here at these things called Himalayan rabbits. And the color of these rabbits is influenced by temperature. So when it's warm, they are completely white because the pigment gene is inactive. So the warm color has inactivated the gene. In the cold, however, they get black markings. And this is because the cold temperature has actually activated this pigment gene. So remember, normally the DNA would create a protein and that protein would create a trait. In this case, though, when it's warm out, the DNA is turned off. The gene is turned off and it won't make the protein, and so it won't make the trait. But in this instance, what I can do is actually put this ice pack. And when I add this ice pack, I actually activate that gene. So now it'll make the protein and it'll actually make the trait. Seems crazy, but you can actually influence the coloring of these rabbits simply by adding ice to a certain area. Now, on the other side, gene activation can be detrimental with things, especially cancer. Now, before we look at that, though, we have to look at this thing called genetic predisposition. And what this means is you have genes that make it more likely for you to get a disease. Predisposed means more likely to get. But these genes very often have to be activated by some sort of environmental factor. So you only get the disease if the environmental factor turns that gene on. So let's look at these three individuals. Person number 1 and 2 are twins. So their DNA is exactly the same. Person number 3 is completely unrelated. Now, person 2 and 3 are smokers. And they smoked for a while, and of all three of these people, person number 2 is the only one who ends up getting cancer. Neither person number 1 nor number 3 gets cancer at any point during their life. So why is person number 2 the only one that got this? He has the same DNA as person 1, and he smoked just like person 3. Why did he get cancer and the others didn't? Well, what we can say is that person number 1 and 2 were genetically predisposed to getting cancer. So they were more likely to get it. Person number 3 was actually genetically protected against cancer. So why did person number 1 not get it if he's genetically more likely to get it? Well, his gene was not activated because he did not have the environmental factor to activate that gene and cause him to get cancer. So if person number 1 had been a smoker, he would have also gotten cancer because that gene would have been activated and he would have gotten it. Now let's look at transcriptional regulation. This means making more or less of a protein. So I think this is just kind of an interesting image. It has the shortest and the tallest man alive. And height is very much dependent on both genetics and just how much human growth hormone you have. So in both of these cases, that system isn't working correctly. The small guy, he is not making pretty much any human growth hormone. So he's making way less protein than you're supposed to, whereas the really tall guy is making way more protein than you're really supposed to. And both of them have problems as a result of this. Now on the beneficial side with this, tanning, we'll look at that here in a second. Insulin, when you eat sugar, your body releases insulin so that it can handle the sugar. Healing. When you get cut, your body needs to ramp up the amount of certain proteins it makes in order to make new cells and heal that wound. So let's look at tanning. Here we have our skin, and coming down from the sun are UV rays. And UV rays are really bad. They can actually mutate your DNA and cause cancer. And so your skin has a protective measure against this. It has a pigment called melanin. Now, when you get exposed to more and more sunlight, your skin cells will start to make more of that protective pigment, and that will darken your skin and thereby help protect you against future exposure to the sun. Now, this can also be detrimental. Things like type 2 diabetes and cancer can both be caused by making too much or not enough of certain proteins. So in the case of type 2 diabetes, the pancreas is normally the organ that creates insulin. So it has cells that create the protein insulin. Now here we have a blood vessel with some cells. When you eat sugar, it goes into your blood, your pancreas releases insulin, and it tells those cells, take this sugar in. And that's how it regulates blood sugar. Now, if you sit around and don't exercise, if you're obese, if you stuff sugar down your face all your life, you can end up breaking this system. Using it too much, it just breaks the system, and the pancreas can no longer create the amount of insulin that you need. So the pancreas stops working correctly. Now when you eat some sugar, the pancreas releases a much smaller amount of insulin, and only a little bit of sugar is actually taken into the cells. So now you have excess sugar in your bloodstream, and then you eat some more, and now it builds up and it builds up, and you get what's called hyperglycemia, or high blood sugar. And this can cause organ failure and all kinds of other things that are associated with type 2 diabetes. All right, and finally we're going to look at how the trait actually shows up. And so differences in the environment can actually cause differences in how the trait looks. So for example, these two hydrangeas are genetically twins. They're identical. And yet one of them's blue and one of them's pink. And the only difference is the pH of the soil that they're grown in. If the soil is below 5.5, it'll be blue. If it's above 5.5, it will be pink. So exact same genetics creates a different looking trait based on an environmental difference, in this case pH. So finally, let's look at what's the bottom line here. The way I think of this is DNA provides a potential. You have a potential for what your traits should look like, and you have a potential for how much of a disease risk you have. The environment, however, is going to determine how that potential is actually met. So how does your trait actually show up? Do you actually get that disease or not? That's based on the environment. And so a lot of people use the term nature versus nurture. And it's really a combination of both. Nature is the genetics that you have. Nurture is the environment and how it influences those genetics to create your traits.